Now that we have PHP installed, we're ready to start learning how to use it. We're going to start by learning how to embed PHP code in a page because there's some basic rules that we need to know about. We already did this in the setup chapter. We created our first file, which was my_phpinfo.php, and we populated with just this one little snippet of code. And you may not have completely understood what it was at the time. You may have just followed along. That's okay. We're now going to talk about it and talk about how this works. Notice that there's the beginning and ending to this line with a bit of code in the middle. I'll drop out the code in the middle so you can really see the difference. This is the beginning of opening a PHP tag and the end, closing PHP. What we're doing is essentially saying to the Apache server, hey, as you're processing this document, turn on PHP. Start reading the next little bit as being PHP code. And then when it gets to the end and it sees that question mark with the greater than, it says, okay, the tag is over. Now we're done with PHP. You can go back to doing your regular HTML rendering. This allows us to embed PHP into the HTML. Remember in the early introduction I talked about that's one of the features of PHP is that we can just embed it in the HTML code. So we're essentially telling Apache to turn on and turn off PHP filtering as it's going through the document. And then in between, we can put whatever PHP code that we want. So if you look at someone else's PHP code, you're going to see these open and closing tags throughout the document as it's turned on and off. This isn't the only way that you can write these PHP tags. There's also something called short open tags. These, I would say, are considered bad form. This is using the same tags, but omitting the letters PHP from it. There's also a form that uses the question mark followed by an equal sign, which outputs the results directly. Normally, evaluating the PHP doesn't output results on its own. You have to tell it specifically, I want to output something here. Otherwise, you could just do some processing. You could add 1 plus 1 and not output the results, just do a calculation in there. That's what the second form is there. This has become more popular, especially a lot of experienced PHP developers have started to prefer having this shortcut, but I think it's still a bad idea, and we'll talk about why in just a second. The other way that you could do it is to use ASP style tags. I think this is considered very poor form. Instead of using the question mark, we use the percent sign. ASP is Microsoft's version of PHP. It's what became ASP.NET. ASP was something that actually existed before ASP.NET. And this is the way that the tags looked. They had the percents on either side. And again, we have that equals there. Both of these options are something that you can turn on and configure in your PHP INI file to allow them. Otherwise, you need to stick with the regular default PHP tags. So why am I saying that this is a bad idea to create these kinds of tags? Well, it's specifically because they're enabled in the PHP INI file. One of the wonderful things about PHP is that the code is portable. A version of PHP on Windows and Mac and Linux is all exactly the same. My code can just run on one, it can be moved to the other one and run there just as easily. But if I make a choice to use a different style of tag, and I require that the PHP INI file be configured a certain way, then my code stops being portable. Now, it will no longer run on this other system because it's not configured correctly. And I think that's a bad thing. If we just stick to the default standard tags, then our code will stay portable. And that's going to be especially true if you start writing code that's going to be a plugin for an existing application like WordPress or Drupal or something. You want to be able to distribute that and have everyone be able to use it. So you want to be in the habit of using good, widely available, widely supported PHP tags. Otherwise, I think you're shooting yourself in the foot before you've even started. There are a couple of other points that I want to make about your PHP code. If we open up our myphpinfo.php file, I want to show you that the white space doesn't matter. White space inside the PHP code doesn't matter. This is just as valid as what we had before. Same here if we put more returns in here, tabs, spaces, those are all considered white space. And PHP doesn't care about those. It completely ignores it. It just executes the code as you go through. And that's great because it allows us then to use white space to help us to create readable code. We can indent things, we can group things together so that it's really nice and easy for us to read and follow. We don't have to worry how the white space is going to be interpreted. Not all languages work that way, and it's one of the nice things about PHP. The other thing I want to point out to you is that notice that the command ends with a semicolon. That's part of the way that PHP helps to know when one command is over and another one is starting. Since white space doesn't matter, it needs to have some reliable way to know this command is finished and I'm ready to move on to the next command. So every line is going to need to end in a semicolon. So get used to it. It's a habit you're going to have to get in with working with PHP is to always put semicolons at the end of your lines. And there's one last thing that I want to show you before we move on. Let's just close this up. We'll save it and close it. And inside our index.html file that we created earlier, if you don't have it, you can just create one, a nice simple file inside here, index.html. Let's open that up and let's just drop a little bit of PHP in there. So open our PHP tags. You can see that it auto closed it for me as well at the same time. That's nice. PHP info with my parentheses and then the semicolon, right? So that's the same little bit of PHP code that I had. Let's save it. We'll close that up and let's now go into our browser and let's load that file up. Localhost, Kevin Skogland, index.html. That's the file I'm loading up. I get hello from my user directory. I did not get the result of that PHP function. It has nothing to do with the fact that there was other text in there at all. In fact, if we view source, under web developer, I can choose page source, and you can see that it actually just output the code itself. It didn't actually do any PHP processing on it. So why is that? I gave it my starting PHP tag and my ending PHP tag. Why didn't it process it? Well, that's because the file ends in .html. It's important that we have both of those things. The file needs to end in .php. That tells Apache, hey, be on the lookout for PHP tags. There may be PHP tags in this document. And then when it sees a PHP tag, it turns on its PHP module, starts processing the PHP until we close the PHP section. So it's important that we have both of these, right? If we start naming our files ending in something besides PHP, it's not going to see it as being a PHP file and try and do any processing on it. Now that we have the fundamentals of how to use PHP tags to embed PHP code into our document, let's start trying to use that with dynamic text.